Hi, Julie Escher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm back with a wedding project. This is actually going to be a contoured box that I'm going to make in various sizes and put together into hopefully a 4-tier wedding cake. In this first part of this 2-part video, I'm going to concentrate on how to make 1 tier, how to contour and how to decorate 1 tier of this cake. And that might be useful to those of you, this is a cookie cake by the way, it's all made out of cookies. This might be useful to you, those of you who don't want to take it all the way up to 3 tiers, as you can see in the photograph, 3 or 4 tiers in the photographs flashing by, but would rather just keep it at 1 level. So this is sort of a stepwise project. In the first part, we'll do the 1 box. In the second part, I'm going to stack 3 tiers that I already have together with the 4th tier and show you how I would decorate it with flowers. Okay, with that said, let's talk about how to contour the pieces for this project. The sides of this project are very similar to the ones that I did in my mosaic cookie box a few weeks ago, so you might want to refer to that. I have a whole video on contouring cookie dough. But just in terms of design process, the first thing I typically think through when I'm doing a project like this, and again it's going to be a 4-tier cake, is like what forms do I have to make the shapes that I need? And I often rely on common household items. So my bottom tier of this cake, which is what you see in front of you, was shaped over the sides of this 4.5 inch saucepan. And I'll have all the exact dimensions for this particular project in the video description. The next tier is slightly smaller, it's about 4 inches. And then I've got a 3rd tier, which is about 3 inches, and a 4th tier, which is about 2 inches. So I like to get out all the various things I can shape my dough around and kind of visualize them. Does that look good, you know, from a perspective standpoint and overall dimensionality? And I thought it did. But the fits are really tight here, which is going to cause some challenges as we put it together a little bit later. That said, let's suppose I've chosen my pieces, or if you just want to do 1 box, you know, just shape around the larger box and fill it with other cookies. Now let's talk about how you shape the dough to form these curved sides, because what you'll need for each box are 2 curved sides and a base that it's going to sit on, a cookie base that it's going to sit on. To get this curved side, again, I have a contoured cookie dough video, but I just wanted to show you a quick setup. I've cut a strip of dough. Most of these were cut about 2.25 inches tall, and I lay it so that it falls halfway around whatever I'm shaping it around. I think this was the 3rd tier on the cake. Stick it in the oven, bake it at my normal temperature. This is my gingerbread dough at 375 for about 10 minutes. Let it cool slightly, then it slides right off. I don't grease this or do anything special to it because I find if I grease it, the dough tends to slide off. Every dough behaves a little differently, so you might have to experiment with your own to see what works best for contouring. But again, I have a whole other video on that. I like this project. It's a departure from some of my others because I'm not using any royal icing to coat the sides. As I did in that mosaic box, I coated the whole lid with royal icing, and that's kind of a messy proposition. So in this case, I'm relying on the beauty of just stenciling and pearl dust, shimmer dust, to create a pattern on the side and a few little royal icing transfers. This is a technique I developed, I believe, for stenciling contoured cookie shapes. You can't use the normal acetate stencil because they don't wrap and fit to the contour of the cookie. So what I'm using instead, I'm just going to elevate my side of my basket up on top of this ring. You can use anything, but I just want to give it a little height so it's easier to spray around. But what I'm using for the stencil is actually a frosting sheet because it will wrap to the contour of the cookie. So I'm going to cut a really long piece. It needs to be really long to go all the way around. So I'm going to use this nice trim piece from Martha Stewart. And the key with this is that once you punch, you have to line up along the guide here and also make sure the piece in the back is up flush against the guide. Otherwise, you'll end up with a strangely cut pattern, as I did on one I cut earlier. So always matching up both in the front and the back before you punch again. And this is going to be my stencil that we'll spray over and then remove later. You could just stick the frosting sheet onto the cookie, but in this case, I really wanted to decorate with a minimum of stuff stuck on the cookie, just because I think it creates a new look, new and different look, kind of a fresh look, and it's also relatively quick. I didn't get that quite perfectly aligned. You'll see a little crimp in that stencil, but we're going to go ahead and work with that. Now, as you see, I really covered my work surface here. Normally when I'm spraying, I spray in my basement kitchen with a hood, going with a mask on it, because I don't think it's altogether great to inhale any of this aerosol stuff. Now, typically, I would have another side to this. You see I already decorated those other two sides we'll be using later. If this were the first of sides, I just want to situate the stencil where I want it. In this case, I know I'm going to be putting a scallop border on top with a little bit of fondant. So I want to anchor this stencil towards the bottom edge of the cookie, if you will, or the top edge, which will become the bottom, either way. And I don't want to stick it down completely because I'll never get it off, but I do want to anchor it enough, I'm going to tip it that way, that the stencil doesn't blow off when I spray it. And so I'm just going to stick down the edges with a little bit of corn syrup. On both sides, and make sure that everywhere, and you can do this with it out, not on this mount if it's easier to start, which it might be because that mount is a little crooked. That mount is really more for the spraying process. So I'm just anchoring a little bit of corn syrup at the end. I don't want it in the middle of the basket because it will leave a shiny spot. Where I have seams on this basket, they'll be covered with flowers later, so I'm not worried if a little corn syrup is there. The other thing to note before I even spray this is before you spray, you want to make sure that the edges of your box are nice and straight and fit together with the opposing side, because your ability to file the edges once this is sprayed is really limited. You'll smudge your spraying. So I've filed mine already. I don't know if you can see, but I used a microplaner to get those nice and straight so they fit up perfectly with the opposing side. And now I'm just making sure the stencil, this frosting sheet, is sitting as flat to the cookie as possible. There's a big dent in the cookie here, but if it doesn't sit as flat, very flat, or lifting off any parts of it, that's where spray can get under the stencil and potentially give you a much less clean stencil. I'm using PME pearl spray, which looks silver against gingerbread. It's actually pearl. Give it a good shake first. And I'm once again just pushing down areas that I see lifting a little bit. And we'll give that a test spray first on the counter. And then I like to work in small circular motions, holding the can as upright as possible. Otherwise it tends to drip. Sometimes that's not always possible. You can see how it gets airborne. So again, nice to do this under a hood or with some mask on. And this is why I like it elevated. It just makes it a little easier for me to get these around the sides of it. I think that's good for now. Now I would let it rest a couple of minutes until I can see that this silver or pearl sheen is relatively dry. It dries pretty instantaneously, but if you move the stencil too soon, you can smudge the stencil. The other thing is any kind of cracking of the dough will be accentuated to some extent by spraying. You can see some of the cracks, which you couldn't see earlier in the dough. But I'm going to be covering that upper edge with some fondant scallops, so some of that will tend to disappear. Plus, if it looks a little rustic, I think that's okay. It looks more antique-y that way. So I just lift off the frosting sheet at this point, and I'm left with a beautiful stenciled half basket. And I do the exact same thing to the other half. Before you put away the whole spray apparatus, the other thing you want to do is spray the bottoms of your boxes, and you can do that in a number of different ways. If you are going to do the multi-tiered cake with all the other little boxes on top, I typically just spray the bases that fit each one solidly pearl because they're just not going to be seen, but that way the edge just looks like it integrates with the rest of the cake. It's silver. However, this is my fourth and biggest bottom tier. I want to have it on a more decorative plate. So I just want to give you an example of what else you could do. I'm not going to show you the whole decorating process because this took quite some time. But this is an 8-inch round, and this is what my base basket's going to go on. I used a combination of what you just saw, stenciling and fondant applique here. But in this case, I used a different kind of punch, just a simple daisy punch from Martha Stewart. And I cut those pieces in half. And when the gingerbread was all bare, I just glued them down all the way around, like so, all the way around, and then sprayed, then lifted them all. And that created that little scrolly pattern, that brown scrolly pattern you see. along the edge. All the rest is stamped fondant applique or dot work that I applied subsequently, and which I'm going to be doing on the upper edge of the box in just the same way. So I'll show you how I did exactly that on the upper edge of the box. So different ways to decorate the bases. I did want to have a much bigger base, an 8-inch, to house my 4 or 5-inch box on the bottom, just to give it a little bottom weight, if you will, because it's going to be quite tall when it's stacked. So my next step for this particular design, and again, you could style these any number of ways. I'm just tending to work with very little icing on some of my recent projects, just because I like the multi-textural sort of effect of using kind of scrapbooking techniques on edibles. So what I'm going to do is finish off the fondant applique. I started the row here. I'm going to show you how I finished that off, and I'm going to apply a few small pink royal icing transfers in between the stenciled areas, and I think that's going to be enough, because as you'll see, when the cake is all put together and each of the tiers has a different set of decorations on it, it can get quite crazy. Let's talk about how I made those fondant appliques. I've touched on this in other videos, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I rolled out fondant to about 1/8 of an inch on my pasta machine, and then rubber stamped with food coloring, my same liquid gel food coloring that I use in flavor and coloring icings. Applied a little bit of it to my foam pad, inked the stamp, and then pressed it into the fondant, and you get this look. My fondant's still soft, and that's good, because what I'm going to do is be cutting these into half spheres. And I'd only need about 4 to fill out the top, so I've got more than enough here. But we'll have a few extra. And I like to choose colors that are similar in quality and hue to one another, so this gives me a little more to choose from. Now I am going to move those to the side and elevate this whole piece to work on it so it's more at eye level. So now, to get down fondant appliques, I just use, again, corn syrup. Thin appliques, I prefer to use corn syrup as opposed to thick royal icing, because thick royal icing can appear more lumpy. And you want to apply these while the fondant is still pliable. I was just about to say flexible, combination of pliable and flexible. Otherwise it'll crack. Now some fondant sets faster than others. I'm working with Satin Ice, which is a brand that sets pretty darn quickly, especially when it's cool and dry out like it is today. So I had those uncovered for about 10 minutes, and that one was pretty brittle actually. This one I just cut is a lot more moist. So keep them covered if you've cut them in advance. Now the only tricky thing about placing appliques or anything on anything that's been sprayed is that you can't really move it. Because if I were to lift this up and decide I totally wanted to change position, I'd lift up all that spray underneath it with it, and you'd see the exposed gingerbread. Again, remember, when I put the box together, these seams, there will be seams, but I'm going to cover them completely with flowers, as you'll see in some of the pictures floating by. So I don't have to worry, I'm not going to worry too much if I don't meet the end perfectly. Like this is going to hang off the end a little bit, but it's going to be behind flowers ultimately. So you want to get the sides of your boxes completely decorated before you start assembling them on their bases, and let them be completely dry. And so there is a definite order to this project. So now I'm just going back, lightly pressing them in to make sure they're flush, but I don't want to handle the faces of them too much because the food coloring on the front could still be slightly tacky. I just did stamp them. Now my last finishing touch, well, not my last finishing touch, my second to last is putting on royal icing transfers. Again, I have a whole video on that. I'm just going to put a small pink one in the middle of each of those diamonds. And again, placement here is crucial, because if I mess up, it's very difficult to replace these. I'll take off a lot of the silver. So I'm always holding the cookie while I'm placing the bead, trying to handle the silver part as little as possible, because my fingers will take it off too. So, to some extent, not always. Some of these are bigger than others, so let me pour them out, because I did want smaller ones in the middle here, so as not to obscure the diamond too much. I don't like this really big one here, so just to show you what happens, see how much I took off. I'll hopefully be able to cover that with a slightly smaller one, but I couldn't do that too many times. So one thing I just did is I stuck this up on bubble wrap, because my cookie was sliding so much. I was having a hard time getting those beads stuck on there. So that helps. It keeps the underlying piece from sliding. The other thing you might notice is it takes sometimes a couple attempts to get the glue on the lustered areas because it doesn't like to stick. So sometimes taking a little bit off can help before it sticks. Okay, so I've got the royally icing transfers on the sides. One thing I had to point out, I put my finger there, so I took off some of the silver dust, and this one I had to replace a couple of times. So I took a little bit of the silver dust off there too. It's not quite perfect, but so just be careful with that. My last accent for this particular design is I'm just gonna mark off, I'm gonna add some little dots along these scallops just to highlight the edge a little bit using brown icing of beadwork consistency. The tip of my cone is hardly open. Just putting a little dotting all the way around. Again, it's useful to have this at eye level because I'm decorating on the side of an object. And I'm going to continue all the way around. Okay, so I've got all the dots on, and now they need to dry completely before I assemble the pieces, or ideally they should. So I'm going to set them aside, clean up, and in the next part, the second part of this video, I'm going to show how to put together a typical box on its individual base and how to fill it and decorate the seams with flowers. I'm going to do that on a tiny little box. And then I'll show you my atypical assembly for the wedding cake. I had to do that somewhat in reverse order for purposes of video. Till then, live sweetly.